This video backs a blog post I produced at the address below. It is in response to an article written by David Harvey in March. In this, Harvey is arguing that Marx did not have a labour theory of value. In fact, that Marx actually repudiated the labour theory of value. I've produced here a short summary of his claims, which he produces at the beginning of the article. He says it's widely believed that Marx adapted a labour theory of value from Ricardo as a founding concept for his study of capital accumulation. Since the labour theory of values has been generally discredited, it is then often authoritatively stated that Marx's theories are worthless. But nowhere, in fact, did Marx declare his allegiance to a labour theory of value. That theory belonged to Ricardo, who recognised that it was deeply problematic, even when he insisted that the question of value was critical to the study of political economy. On the few occasions when Marx comments directly on the matter, he refers to value theory, not the labour theory of value. Harvey's argument rests on the assumption that the labour theory of value has been discredited. But discredited in what sense? We know that people in economics departments don't like it. But that's mainly for political reasons. Since the day of Marx, the labour theory of value came to be associated with the socialist movement. And since academic economists generally didn't want to be associated with socialism, they've been at pains to distance themselves from it. But they haven't actually produced empirical evidence to refute it. It has been socially discredited, but it hasn't been empirically refuted. These are two different things. How do you actually refute a theory? Well, if it's a theory in pure maths, you can refute it logically. The economists tend to think that economics is a matter of pure maths, but it's not. It's about the real world. And for theories about the real world, any refutation has to be empirical. Suppose you want to refute the theory that the earth is flat. Well, it's no good trying to do this by arguing from theology or arguing from geometry as an ideal science. You have to do it from observations. This was done a long time ago, of course. It was done by Eratosthenes, a Ptolemaic scientist, Hellenic scientist, who refuted the idea that the earth was flat by going to Cyrene, near Aswan in Egypt. There he observed that if you looked at the sun at midday, at midsummer's day, it was directly overhead. And he checked that by looking down a well and showing that the sun shone directly to the bottom of the well, and therefore it must have been directly overhead. At the same time, in Alexandria, he had a measurement done of the angle of the sun that could be seen in Alexandria. And that was done by measuring the shadow cast by a large pillar. From the angle of the sun in Alexandria and the angle of the sun in Aswan, he compared the two. It was overhead in Aswan, but at an angle of about 7 degrees in Alexandria. Now that would not have been the case if the earth was flat. If the earth was flat, the angle of the sun would be the same in both places. Not only that, he was able to get a very accurate estimate of how large the earth was and what the radius of the earth was. He was able to get a radius that was within a few % of what we now know it to be. He didn't do this by mathematical reasoning. He did it by observation. Now, the labour theory of value predicts that prices of commodities will vary proportionally with their labour content. Refuting this should be easy. You just have to show that their prices do not vary with their labour content in this way. But this is not what economists opposed to the labour theory of value did. They didn't bother trying to collect data to do the tests. So for a century after Marx, the theory was discredited socially, but never empirically refute it. As soon as economists start to test data and use the reasonably good statistics which became available after the 1940s for whole economies, what do they find? They found that Ricardo and Marx had been right all along. There's a whole bunch of statistics that I cite in my blog which have, since the 1980s, shown that the labour theory of value is a very good way of predicting what the level of prices will be. In a previous video, I produced this graph, which shows how for British industries, a dot indicates an industry here. The x-axis is the number of person years which were directly and indirectly used to produce the output of that industry, and the vertical axis shows the amount of money that the output of that industry sold for. And you can see that there is a linear relationship between them. There is a little bit of scatter here, but it's a small amount of scatter, and the linear relationship is what is predicted by Ricardo's theory. Ricardo said the relationship should be a 93% correlation. In fact, the correlation is considerably better than that. Now, it might be objected this is just because some industries are big. This was an objection raised by Klimans, and that the correlation is just an effect of the size of the industry. But you can easily show that this isn't an adequate explanation. What you do is compare the match one gets using labour with the match that one gets using some other input like electricity or iron or something. Using the same procedure that you use to work out how much labour went into making something, you can work out how much electricity went into making something. And you can then see how well do all these other factors predict the final output. Now, here is the same data for labour plotted along there, and this is the scatter of points we get for a variety of other inputs that you could have used as a basis for value. The red squares are iron and steel, the triangles are electrical input, and the crosses are computer and related activities. What is obvious from this is that none of these other factors come close to giving the close relationship between price and input that labour does. So the labour theory of value is confirmed, and the idea that it's just an effect of industry size is refuted, because if it was an effect of industry size, this would show whichever input you used. So Klimans' objection has been refuted as well. Harvey next complains that Marx nowhere declares an allegiance to the labour theory of value. This is true, because at the time when Marx was writing, that was the only theory of value going. It was simply called the theory of value. It was only afterwards, after the alternative marginal utility, or what's now called the neoclassical theory of value, was established, that the contradiction between the labour theory of value and the utility theory of value existed. So saying that Marx didn't explicitly say he was a proponent of the labour theory of value is as silly as saying Newton never said he was a supporter of classical or Newtonian mechanics. You only have a distinction later on when other theories, like the theory of relativity in the case of physics, or in the case of economics, the Jevons marginalist theory came around. But after Jevons, economists distinguished between the classical or labour theory of value and the neoclassical theory of value, which was also the marginalist theory of value. But Marx couldn't take sides in this debate. It only started after Capital was published. Jevons' book on economics came out 4 years after Capital. At the time Marx was writing, it was still widely accepted that labour was the source of value. Even Jevons accepted that prices were proportional to labour, and he used his marginal theory to try and prove this. So, Harvey says that Ricardo and Marx had different theories. I say they had the same theory. The only way you can tell whether a theory is the same or different is to say whether the predictions of causal relations in the world are the same. So what did Ricardo's theory say, and did Marx agree with him? Now, when you compare two theories, you shouldn't pay too much attention to the vocabulary they use, especially if they wrote in different languages. What's important is the relationship between the concepts they use, whatever names they use for the concepts, and what the theories say are going to happen in the real world. And when you look at this, you see that Marx followed Ricardo's theory extremely closely. There are four key theses in Ricardo's theory, and Marx agrees with every one of them. The first is the exchangeable value of commodities will vary with their direct labour content. So if more direct labour is used for something, its value will rise. Ricardo also says that indirect labour used to make raw materials and equipment also contributes proportionally to the exchange value. Marx agrees with that. Ricardo also emphasises that it's the labour actually expended on making things, not the pay the workers receive, which determines value. Marx also agrees with that. The whole of the small book Value, Price and Profit is devoted to showing that point. And Ricardo also says that the variation of price with labour will be modified by the formation of an equal rate of profit on stock. Marx agreed with that, and his chapters on the transformation problem in volume 3 of Capital are devoted to this point. In my blog I produce quotations from Marx and Ricardo showing that each of them agreed on each of these points. So their theories are identical. They differ only in terminology. And we know that points 1, 2 and 3 have been confirmed by empirical data, by the studies I quoted before. Point 4 about an equal rate of profit is poorly supported by, or probably refuted by, the empirical data. Empirical data indicates that there isn't an equal rate of profit, and that it's an unrealistic assumption to assume that there's an equal rate of profit. So Marx and Ricardo are saying the same thing when they're both right on points 1, 2 and 3, and they say the same thing even when they're both wrong on point 4, which is a pretty clear indication that Marx got his theory from Ricardo and is repeating a slightly elaborated version of it. People will say that there is another innovation by Marx, though, that I haven't covered, which is the difference between abstract and concrete labour, and that this isn't present in Ricardo. Now, I can see that the specific phrase concrete labour was new, but the distinction between the two is clearly present in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Smith simply uses the word labour, unqualified, where Marx uses the term abstract labour at times, though Marx often also says just labour. Smith specifically says that when he's talking about labour in this way, he's talking about labour in the abstract. He says the greater part of people understand what it means by a quantity of a particular commodity than a quantity of labour. The one is a plain palpable object, the other an abstract notion, which, although it can be made sufficiently intelligible, is not altogether so natural or obvious. It's worth remembering that the start of Smith's Wealth of Nations, the first chapter of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, is devoted to discussing the division of labour, where he discusses the division of abstract labour into what he calls different varieties of labour or different sorts of labour. This is actually the same distinction that Marx is making when, using the slightly different terms, he talks of abstracting from concrete labours or kinds of labour. A moment's thought shows that it's impossible to talk about the division of labour unless you have a concept of abstract labour, because what sort of labour can be divided? It's only labour in the abstract that is being divided, because it is being divided into specific sorts, specific kinds, specific concrete kinds of labour, to use Marx's terminology. We can have a terminology table here. So the first concept that is present in both Marx and Smith is something which Smith uses the term variety, kind and palpable to refer to, and Marx uses the term kind or concrete. The second concept is what Smith calls just labour, and he qualifies this as being an abstract notion of labour, and Marx sometimes calls abstract labour. These are the same concepts, they're slightly different words. Marx, in capital, is simply re-explaining, using his words, the concepts which had already been put forward by Adam Smith and were not seen as particularly novel at that time. There are real differences, though, between Marx and the classical economists. Marx emphasizes that labour is only represented as exchange value in societies with private ownership. Marx says it's absent in traditional Indian society or in the ingenious communism, as he puts it, of the Incas, whereas Smith and Ricardo seem to assume that even in the most primitive societies, people are engaging in trade and barter. Marx also makes a distinction between labour and labour power, which was a novelty on his part. He also introduces the idea of surplus value as a prior and more general category than profit, interest and rent, into which surplus value is divided. Marx introduces a new theory of the falling rate of profit. Smith and Ricardo recognised a falling rate of profit, but had a different theory for it. Each of them had different theories for it. Marx also has an explicit repudiation of Say's law, that supply brings its own demand. He also modifies Ricardo's theory of rent by introducing the category of absolute ground rent, where Ricardo only had differential ground rent. And in terms of modes of production, he recognises more modes of production than Adam Smith did. Adam Smith only recognised 3 modes of production. And finally, of course, Marx says he didn't invent the class struggle. What was novel to him was the recognition that the class struggle leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat and communism.